Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Richard Martin, and I will be your host for today. So today we have a group of panelists. We have a little bit of a technical problem. That's my fault. We didn't have the video activated for our panelists, but they are here and they are able to speak and answer your questions. So we'll still be able to cover your topics. Today we're going to, they will cover and answer the question of who can low intensity vibration therapy manage your osteoporosis, was the intent here. But before we start, I want to cover a few things. First, the webinar itself and its contents do not constitute medical advice. It is for information purposes only. If you have a medical condition, such as osteoporosis in this case, you should consult your physician or another licensed healthcare professional. Second, Margaret and I do not represent Marodyne or sell low-intensity vibration devices, including the Marodyne. However, if you do purchase a Marodyne device and use the discount code associated with MilliGuide, we receive a small commission. Third, we've had about 500 people register for this webinar, and we opened it up and asked for questions in advance, and we received well over 50 questions, so it's quite a few. Where it made sense, I grouped the questions together for our panelists. And as a result, you may not hear your exact question when I call it out to them. However, we'll try our best to cover the topics as best we can in this limited amount of time. We are recording the webinar, and we will post it on our YouTube channel at a later date. Finally, we organized this webinar because many of Margaret's clients had many questions about low-intensity vibration as a modality and as a treatment for osteoporosis. In early 2021, Margaret interviewed Dr. Clinton Rubin, who thankfully is on this call, and we published the interviews on our YouTube channel, where the interviews have been viewed over 160,000 times, which is quite a few. We got a lot of questions, and we decided we should invite both Dr. Rubin as well as Ian Cutts from Marodyne US to answer your questions. So here we are, and we're glad that you could join us. I'll cover the agenda now. So as it follows, the first speaker will be Dr. Rubin. Dr. Rubin will provide an overview of low-intensity vibration. He'll cover how it works, and he'll update us on the research as it stands with regards to osteoporosis and bone health. Dr. Rubin is a distinguished professor of biomechanical engineering at Stony Brook University. He's also the director of the Center for Biotechnology and the director of Musculoskeletal Research Laboratory. And he is a leading research on this topic of vibration therapy. Ian Cutts from Marodyne US will follow Professor Rubin, and he will provide an overview of the Marodyne LiV, so he'll get specifically into the product. Ian has 30 years of experience in the medical technology industry. For the last 20 years, Ian has dedicated himself to low-intensity vibration technology. He formed Copa Healthcare to supply Marodyne products in the United States and provide ongoing support for people who purchase the product. Our final speaker or panelist will be Margaret Martin. Margaret will discuss where and when she sees and when she recommends the LiV for her clients and in what circumstances. Margaret is a registered physiotherapist with 38 years of clinical experience. For the past 15 years, she's devoted her practice to clients with osteoporosis. Margaret is the author of 3 books on exercise and osteoporosis and numerous online courses and safe osteoporosis exercise workouts. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Rubin. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks, Margaret, for inviting me back to join you guys in discussing mechanical strategies to suppress osteoporosis. Thanks to all the registrants and for those joining in. I'm particularly sorry that the video is not working because I spent at least an hour putting on makeup, but we'll just move forward as best we can. Both Margaret and Richard have been very forthcoming with asking me questions over the past year and a half or so since we did the interviews. And I'm really thrilled that people who are following MilliGuide have been interested enough in low-intensity vibration to really ask pretty pointed questions about its efficacy, the mechanism of action, its safety. And so what I would like to do is just give a quick overview of where it came from, at least in our lab, and what our commitment is to seeing the science and the technology translate to the clinic. And even though the focus of many of Margaret's clients and her followers of Melio Guide are people interested in peri and postmenopausal osteoporosis, I will also point out that a range of our approaches of using low intensity vibration include sort of childhood diseases which compromise the musculoskeletal system. The focus of my discussion will be on bone, although we have looked at a range of other things, including obesity and muscle decline. I'll try to touch on these as we go, but again, with the idea being, where does this come from and why is it relevant to you? Let me jump in from the start. So our lab out here on Long Island in New York has been studying how mechanical signals influence bone and the skeleton for over 30 years, maybe even 40 years. And it really started for me as a basic science question, sort of a form follows function challenge. How does use it or lose it apply to the skeleton? And it goes back both in understanding the nature of evolution of vertebrates and of humans. Hunter-gatherers, do they have more bone than people who just sort of sit in huts and cook food? And up to the point of, in modern times, the challenges of long-term space flight. Do astronauts who are denied gravity as they're moving around, does that compromise the skeleton? And the punchline to that story, of course, is that when you're denied gravity or when you're denied load bearing, the skeleton rapidly wastes away. So think of the skeleton, or our lab certainly thinks of the skeleton, as a finely tuned responsive tissue that perceives and responds to its mechanical environment, both in a positive way, sort of the more you use your bone, the more demands you make on it, the more robust it comes. Think of Serena Williams, certainly been in the news quite a bit lately. She has about 35% more bone on her playing arm than her non-playing arm. This is true for all professional tennis players. And there is a good example of local adaptation within a given organism. So that's a good example of the plus side. On the negative side, astronauts, as they're moving along, they can find themselves losing up to 2 to 3% of their bone per month. That becomes a real complication if you're planning a 9-month trip to Mars, where you can end up with half the skeleton that you started with. So it's a real problem. And then when you sort of extrapolate that to sort of normal Earth abiding humans, it's a problem that faces around 20 to 30 million people in the US alone. So there are, as both Richard and Margaret have pointed out, there are FDA-approved strategies for combating this. These are drug-based, both anti-resorptive. These are drugs that slow the loss of bone, or they are anabolic, drugs that stimulate the formation of bone. And if you consider low-intensity vibration or alternative strategies to build up or protect your bone, I would strongly recommend that you do this in concert with good, hard advice. Oh, wait, there I am. No, that you coordinate these decisions from with your physician. Hi, Margaret. Hi, Richard. Hi, Ian. Hi, everybody. I'm Clint. I took my makeup off. Sorry. I think it was just going to be the radio. But just scores of people, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people have written to me over the years saying, yes, Clint, this is all fine and good. We understand that there are drug treatments for osteoporosis, but really there's a large cohort of patients, both men and women, who don't want to be faced with taking a drug for the next couple of decades to prevent a disease. So everyone's looking for other ways to control their bone. So back to where we started and looking at what mechanical signals drive the bone response, again, from a basic science question. We also recognize that if we could figure out, let's say, the proper exercise regime to maintain and protect your skeleton, this could be very relevant to the control or the reversal of osteoporosis. Again, all fine and good. So what we've found over the past couple of decades and how Margaret and Richard, how we found each other and sort of building a long relationship I've had with Ian Cutts, is that we found that, yes, really intense exercise for short periods at a time are good for your skeleton, but they're not for everyone. I mean, not play tennis against Serena Williams every day because the outcomes are probably pretty predictable. But what we found in our lab is that you could also achieve a protection of the skeleton by putting really, really small signals in to the skeleton, but put them in at very high cycle numbers. So rather than playing Serena Williams for 1 minute before you collapse on the side out of exhaustion, you could do it by basically putting in very, very, very small signals for long periods of time. Let's say, for example, that if you could walk for 30 hours per day, which is kind of tough to do, that would be the same as very, very intense exercise. We also found, however, that these smaller signals, if you compress them in time, so rather than loading up your bone at 1 cycle per second, that you put them in at many cycles per second. That's called cycles per second, or hertz. So rather than 1 cycle per second or 1 hertz, you put them in at 20 or 30 cycles per second. And what we found is not responsive to these higher frequency signals, but strangely enough, the bone was even more sensitive to them when they were in this higher frequency domain. So we could make the signals even smaller and smaller. Again, very exciting from a basic science viewpoint, very important in terms of physiology, because many of the systems we have, the way we see, the way we hear sounds and tones, the way that we feel texture, is all frequency dependent. Why not bone? In essence, every cell in your body is responsive to mechanical signals, but they're very specific windows in which they are most sensitive. So cutting to the chase here, we found that if we put in these high frequency signals that were very low intensity into cells or into preclinical models, animal models of osteoporosis, and then into clinical trials, kids, postmenopausal women, perimenopausal women, et cetera, that we found that we could fight bone loss. Some conditions we could stimulate bone gain, and in other conditions we could slow bone loss. So what we did, we being an academic in a university environment, we protected this invention with intellectual property. It was licensed by the company Marodyne, which Ian is here to represent. I'm certainly not here to sell you devices either. I'm here to present the science behind it. But that we're very, very excited that the clinical trials that we were seeing, the results from them, which are funded by federal organizations everywhere from Australia to America to Europe, hospital organizations, et cetera, through peer-reviewed grants, through peer-reviewed IRBs, which are human use for safety, and for peer-reviewed publications. I'm here confident that there is great potential for low-intensity vibration to fight osteoporosis. I can, as Richard poses the questions, try to address the mechanism of action, which is how it works. How do cells perceive these really small signals? And I'm also happy to wrestle with questions about, does it work better in some populations than others? Absolutely true. and why that might be. So that's my introduction. Richard was kind enough to give me 10 to 15 minutes. I think I'm right at 15 minutes. And because I'm 2,000 miles away, I can't feel him kick me under the desk. But with that, I'm going to turn it back to Richard to introduce the next speaker.
Well, thank you, Professor Rubin. Very much appreciate that overview. And I'll have some questions for you. Our attendees will have some quick questions for you a bit later. So we're going to pass it on to Ian, and Ian is from COPA, and he's representing Marodyne US, and he's going to give us an overview of the product. There are some questions around the product, which we'll cover again later on in the session when we wrap up. So Ian, I'm going to pass it to you, and you're going to take it from here. So here you go. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, so what I'd like to talk about is the Marodyne device itself. So the product which is now available is manufactured in Germany by a manufacturer called BTT Health, GmbH. The device, the Marodyne platform, is a low-intensity vibration device with a constant, this is the really important part, it's a constant acceleration, 0.4 G-force, which is at a 30 cycles per second frequency. So that's a really key component of the device, that it maintains the specific acceleration throughout its session of use to the person standing on it. Now, the product inside the United States is a Class 1 powered exercise device. However, when you go outside the United States into Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and other countries, it is a Class 2 medical device approved for the treatment of osteoporosis, amongst other things. And those can include muscle strengthening and balance improvement, and also enhanced circulation. So the product is exactly the same, it just has different regulatory status when it comes to the United States compared to the other countries. The design of the Marodyne is quite clever. What you basically have is a digitally controlled sound wave, which is moving the person standing on the top of the device up and down a really small distance, between 100 and 200 micrometers. But at 30 times a second, that creates the 0.4 G acceleration. And then inside the device, there is a closed loop feedback, which is basically monitoring the loading, because every individual has a different body composition and weight, and they're a dynamic load when they're standing on the plate to start with. And also, if you think about a 10-minute session of use, you're not going to be like a concrete block. You know, you will move. So the loading can change through that session of use. So the device constantly monitors the load upon it to always put into the bottom of the foot a 0.4 G acceleration. So this is really quite important, as the clinical data and basic science built over the last 30 odd years or so has been developed with machines which maintain specific acceleration levels in the low intensity realm. Now, the device itself is designed for home use. It's portable. Weight is around 18 pounds, and in inches, it's about 18 inches wide, 14 inches deep, and 3 inches high. So it's designed to be able to be moved around and easily used in a residential environment. Plus, it will work with electrical currents at 110 up to 240 volts. So like a modern computer, it can be used in various places. So there are some questions which we can take obviously later on, but I wanted to sort of pick up a couple of those which had been submitted prior to the webinar. It's a design for long life. So these should be 10 years plus. They're extremely robust. Failures, if they could occur, would be around the sort of areas of electronic or electrical components. And they can be done in a straightforward way. We take care of them in the United States, and other distributors around the world have their own repair capabilities. So the Marodyne organization is able to look after devices once somebody has purchased one and any warranty period may have expired. The price, which is mentioned by quite a lot of people, is not low. At the same time, there are real reasons why it is what it is. Because it's a medical device, there's a lot of regulatory requirement, both in the manufacturing and everything associated to that, and also the approval for it to be inside various countries. It's manufactured in Germany. With the issues that we've been seeing with China and other sources over the last 2 years, causing supply chain problems, we've been doing a lot of work to resource and resupply from within Europe, for example. So material costs have increased significantly. And we have very high shipment costs these days. So those factors all go back to the reason why the Marodyne is at a sort of price point that it has. And the design, which is quite sophisticated and smart, so electronically controlled, ensures that the device is doing what it's supposed to do, but there is a cost associated to that. There are a number of lower cost vibration plates around, but they don't possess the same capability profile of these Marodyne units. For a person to get one, it's extremely simple to use. It just needs to be connected to the power supply, switched on, person stands on it, and it runs for a 10-minute session, and then it will go to sleep between uses. So really, they were the things I wanted to cover, and I'd like to now hand back to Richard.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks for that coverage. So I think what we'll do now is we'll hand it over to Margaret, and Margaret will cover where she sees it being used and which client situation she advocates it. So Margaret, all yours.
Great, thank you so much. So I make recommendations very much based on my very long conversation with Dr. Clinton. So if you haven't listened to those, they're up on YouTube, and I highly recommend. It is a long listen, but it's worthwhile. So Dr. Clinton, if I have been making recommendations that you think are outside of your recommendations based on our conversations, please let me know. But hopefully the way I have been prescribing it is in accordance to your recommendations. So the first way I recommend it with clients is when I have somebody come in, and primarily as a physical therapist, physiotherapist, my focus is around exercise. But we know when it comes to bone health that nutrition is very important. We know that hormonal status is important and medication is important. But if all those bases are covered and someone's doing the best they can on exercise and they're saying, is there anything else I can do? Then I will always say, absolutely. It comes at a price, but it is a very powerful device that can both, on your off days, if you're feeling really bad, if you have COVID, which I went through a few weeks ago, if you, have a metatarsal fracture that's, delayed in healing and it's stopping you from being active, if you have plantar fasciitis, if you have your hip is sore, and, we look at our calendar of exercise and we go, wow, I really haven't moved as much as I thought. And as Dr. Clinton says, our bone cells respond to mechanical stimulation. So be it that you're actually doing it or that the plate is doing it and helping you to keep your bones healthy. Now, then that's true when we're younger, with a lot of my clients who are over the age of 50. And I think Dr. Clinton would say that cell senescence probably starts even before that. And that was a word I had to learn, cell senescence. I think I'm saying it right. And so our cells are just getting old and don't respond as well to the same stimulus. So Serena Williams, if she starts playing tennis again and gets back into the game in 30 years, she'll probably still be able to play beautifully, but her bones won't respond as well as they did when she was younger. So even though I work out so hard, I know my bones aren't responding as well as I wish they did. And so having the LIV as a kind of a wake up for the mesenchymal stem cells so that my workout counts more, that's where I will use it. And I will recommend that my clients use it. That's one thing. The other times that I will use it is when I have clients that I just know either they have never exercised hard in their life, they might have, done some great hikes, but they just don't know the feeling of lifting hard. So the accessibility of a high intensity regular program is challenging for them. So that's where, again, you can supplement with the LIV so that the lifting that you're doing is counting more for your bones. The studies out of Hong Kong, or the study out of Hong Kong that looked at improving fracture healing at the femur, made me confident when I have clients. I rarely see anybody with acute fractures, but those who have delayed healing, I will recommend that they consider the intensity vibration platform. And I know Dr. Clinton came up with another product specific to localized healing, but that's another conversation. And then I have clients who, as we get older, we do get, not everybody, but some of us get prolapses. And so we know jumping is great, but not always great if you have a prolapse. So if you have a prolapse and you're not comfortable jumping, or you haven't, gone to see a pelvic floor therapist, or you don't have a pessary that you're wearing to assist in your prolapse, all of those things makes it more comfortable and safer to be on the LIV, something high intensity, such that where it comes to the jumping and the intense running and lifting. So those are some of the populations or people that I'll suggest LIV for, which is pretty much everybody. But sometimes I encourage some people more than others to use it based on their T-scores and their energy levels. So, okay. I hope that was clear.
Great, Margaret, thanks for that overview, and maybe I could just build on some of the things that you've raised.
Yes.
Probably, to me, when people ask me a similar sort of question, I either refer them to you because don't really know the specifics of that subject or that T-score, et cetera. But some of the most important things that people ask me is, can I get away with exercising or standing on an LIV device 2 or 3 times a week? And to me, this is one of perhaps the most important element of exercise or functionally challenging your skeleton, is to do it every day. And the reason I say that is not just a suspicion on my part, but going back to the issue of these bone cells, they're called osteoblasts, the bone-forming cells, osteocytes, the cells that reside within the cortex of bone, and also the cells that reside in the bone marrow. They're called mesenchymal stem cells, because it's sometimes a bit of a mouthful. We often call them MSCs. But when these adult stem cells are sitting in your bone marrow, these are what are signaled by your activity to differentiate or to grow into becoming bone cells. The problem with MSCs is that if you don't stimulate them, they either begin to hibernate or they actually grow up to become fat cells. So you can think of as all of us age, that what happens is you are fighting the loss of bone. At the same time, you're combating the gain of subcutaneous and visceral fat. It's not disconnected. People tend to think of, oh, well, I'm not exercising very much. I'm eating too many Oreo cookies. I'm gaining weight, etc. But some of that is because your MSCs are no longer being driven to become bone. So exercising every day keeps sending this persistent signal to this stem cell population to make sure that they do the right thing and become bone and muscle and ligament and tendon, and they don't become fat. But allow me to add, remember we started this conversation by talking about, well, if you're a couch potato and just hanging out all day long, you're not sending this mechanical signal to bone, so you're not stimulating it to grow, but you're also allowing your marrow, the very home of where these MSCs are, you're allowing your marrow to turn to fat. And this is where, so if you're a active, healthy 25-year-old, male or female, doesn't matter, standing on an LIV device probably isn't going to do much good for you. But as we begin to age, as we're 50, 60, 70, 80, or 90, what happens is it takes much more signal to convince that MSC to become bone, because all these other factors, the endocrine factors, the nutritional factors, cell senescence, and you got it just right, Margaret, that they're all driven to turn these cells to fat. So things like exercising every day are very, very important. And these signals in driving, convincing these MSCs to become bone cells, they are transient. You can't just exercise really hard on Sunday and hope that by Wednesday the cells can continue to decide to become bone cells. They will regress back to a bone cell couch potato state within 24 hours. So if listening to Ian, to Richard, to Margaret and I, if you decide not to go with LIV, certainly I have no problem with that. If you take any message home from this conversation, it's to exercise or to stand on a vibrating device at least once per day. Otherwise, you're exercising 2 or 3 times per week. What you're doing is you're fighting this inertia within the cell populations where they just start getting lazy, and you need to wake them up and get them to do the right thing. So exercise once per day. Margaret and I have to talk time and again about, is exercising enough? I'm certainly not going to play Serena Williams twice per day in tennis, I assure you. But what we also found from a basic science viewpoint is the cells adapt to their mechanical environment in real time. So if you go run down to the bus stop and back, or run to the refrigerator to get a Coca-Cola and come back to continue this conversation, that's sending a signal to the cell. They will begin to adapt within a 2 to 3 hour period, and their cytoskeleton, the way the cells are formed, their phenotype, actually changes within that 3 hour period, and they become even more sensitive to mechanical inputs. So if you were to schedule exercise and you had 1 hour per day for exercise, which is great, don't let me get in your way, but to do it in 2 half-hour sessions, so 2 sessions twice a day for 30 minutes each, that will even sort of ratchet up the response. So if even though Ian has worldwide approvals for treating osteoporosis everywhere except for in the US, and even though it says stand on a device for 10 minutes per day, when people reach out to me, I said, well, even better, even though it's not really undermining, but building up on what the FDA, on what these regulatory agencies are suggesting. Today for 5 minutes is even better, not because it's easier to fit into your schedule, but because the cells are adapting and becoming even more responsive. So Margaret, you hit on all the right numbers. I agree with everything you say, even your pronunciation of senescence. But I would say that exercising every day is critically important.
So I'm just going to actually make one quick correction. Sorry, Richard. When you said 25 to 35-year-olds maybe wouldn't benefit from the LIV, because there are so many 25 to 35-year-olds that spend so much time gaming in a slouched position for hours, sometimes the entire day. And their mesenchymal stem cells also need stimulation. Right. So if they gained at least standing on the platform, they'd have that. But,
So fair enough. And I stand corrected. I should have said healthy, active 25-year-old. I stand corrected. But it's absolutely true. And in a good way to look at this from under the blankets from a scientific perspective is, again, to look at the marrow itself. So when we're kids, before we're teenagers, Your marrow is full of blood, it's pluripotent, there's stem cells everywhere. The cliche in the orthopedic clinic is that if you break your bone at the playground, it's started to heal by the time you're in the emergency room. The healing process is very active, and that's because not only are there regenerative cells in the hematoma, the callus that begins to form, that soft callus, but that they're recruited quite readily from this very red marrow, this blood-enriched marrow of young kids. Sort of from teenagers up to 25, 35 or so, your marrow is sort of more on the order of, let's say, yellow. And if you, I don't know if there are carnivores out there, but maybe if you look inside a calf bone when you're at the supermarket versus a cow bone, you can see red marrow versus yellow marrow. But if you see marrow at the shopping center from a beefsteak that is gray, that's more likely from an old cow and tough meat, of course. But in the conversation relevant to the conversation here, that what's happened is that as that marrow changes from red to yellow, that means your marrow is turning more to fat. It's being displaced by fat. So if Margaret would tell her followers that osteoporosis and osteopenia is the wasting away of bone, absolutely true. The other way of thinking of it is that the bone is being displaced by fat because there are no vacuums in our bone. So as your bone, your trabeculae, your cortices are becoming thinner and thinner, that's the expanding of fat itself, right? So the fat is declining the number of the MSCs that could become bone. And then the real challenge is that we become elderly or postmenopausal or elderly, that your marrow has gone from yellow to gray. So the real goal there is to take what MSCs you have and the bone cells that you have and convince them not to become senescent, but to keep producing bone. But the punchline to this is, Margaret, you're right. The 25-year-old that decides, I'm young, I'm going to live forever, therefore I can sit on the couch and game forever. Their bone is wasting away. Their MSCs are lots of them. They're turning to fat. And you're right. I mean, it's a problem that plagues astronauts. It's a problem that plagues people that are confined to wheelchairs. It's a problem even in young kids with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy or cerebral palsy. It's nothing wrong with their bone cells per se, but that they're not being loaded so that the MSCs, they don't know what's going on. They're just turning to fat. So you're absolutely right. Sorry.
Okay. So very good. We need to move on to the questions for a couple of reasons. Number one, we have a lot of questions. And number two, I'd like to go exercise after this. So I was hoping to get out and do that. So I broke them up into different categories. I do ask, I think you've covered a number of them in your talks between the three of you, but I do ask if you can answer the questions quickly, if possible. So I'll start with, if that's at all possible. So I'll start with the topic of efficacy. There's been a number of questions around that, and I think you fully expect this one to come, which is basically, I'll start with question one. This is two together. Are there any peer-reviewed papers on the effectiveness of low-intensity vibration therapy in the treatment of osteoporosis? And somebody else added to that, are there any trabecular bone score data over time with the use of the Marodyne? So let's try to get see if I'll send, I think that's probably a Clint question. Sure. I'll head it your way. And if we can kind of get to that quickly, then we can move on to the next one.
I could try it. Yeah, there are, thanks for the question. And it's certainly a pertinent question. I would ask the same question myself if I were you. There are several peer-reviewed papers that show that LIV can slow bone loss. That would be one. And remember that the goal here is not necessarily to gain bone, but to stop the further loss of bone. But there's a study done, I think the earliest one was 2004 in a collaboration we did with Bob Recker at the University of Nebraska. There are studies coming out of Hong Kong from the Chinese University of Hong Kong K.S. Leong have published not only on peri and postmenopausal women, but as Margaret pointed out, the ability of these signals to accelerate the healing of fractures in femoral neck fractures in postmenopausal women. And actually, sort of scanning to current times, a paper published, I believe, in 2021, so last year, by a group from the University of Pennsylvania, Shamit Rajapaksa, published a paper where he actually used MRI in a group of postmenopausal women. So this not only answers the LIV, building up the quantity of bone, but the quality of bone, how well it connects to each other, which goes to the TBS, the trabecular bone score issue. So the UPenn group published in the Journal of Bone and Mineral Research a paper that shows LIV showed significant improvements in trabecular bone score and bone strength in postmenopausal women. So long answer to the short question is, yes, there are a range of peer-reviewed papers that show efficacy in postmenopausal women.
Thank you. I think we've got a number of those on the blog post that's on our website. So on the mail list, I've shared that with people, so they're free to visit that there and spend their time reading that. Okay, so the next question is, have there been any studies related? I do see this one coming up quite a bit. Have there been any studies on or comparisons with less costly vibration platforms?
I could try that one as well. So let me assure people that are patient enough to listen that I'm a scientist. I'm studying the science of mechanical signals on stem cells. It's what I do for a living. Clinical trials of all the studies I've done over the past 40 years as a scientist, clinical trials are by far the hardest things I've ever done. My cells listen to me and they show up every day, or my preclinical studies, my mice or my rats or my rabbits or my sheep or my whatever, they're very compliant and they show up every day for my studies in the lab. People are tough. So clinical trials, they're very expensive. They're hugely time-consuming, and they're pretty persnickety. So when I run a clinical trial, I ask a question about, can it influence this disease? I don't design a trial to test one device versus another. I have a device. It's something that I very, very much believe in, and I'm trying to find out how well it works to curb disease. It's the goal, my goal as a scientist. It's not my goal as a scientist to compare it to other devices. So I would ask, if I were listening to this talk and I had a favorite device, device X or company Y, I would ask them to show you the clinical trial results from their studies. I know the field pretty well, and there are very, very few hardcore peer-reviewed clinical trials out there that look at different devices. So long answer to your short question, no, I've never compared the two, but I do know quite a bit about devices out there, and many of them are terrifying.
Okay. So there's a related question, which kind of, and this will be the last in this category of around research and efficacy, and that's the source of this is, and the reason why I'm asking is because there's some confusion about the hertz rate, the clock rate that was in our article, our post on our website, plus the interviews you had earlier with Margaret. So I'll ask the question from the reader. I have a platform, and it's a brand, I won't name the brand, which I purchased, which, by the way, is an expensive brand, I looked it up, which I purchased quite a few years ago and used sporadically. How long would it take to see an improvement by using the vibration settings at 30 hertz for 10 minutes per day, as in your posted interview? And is there a way of knowing if there's an improvement, as you can only get a bone density scan once a year? So it's not a Marodyne device or a device that you developed. That's a different brand.
Thanks, Richard. So I could try that one as well. If your device out there and you like it and you're happy with it and your family and physician support you using it, great. What you need to understand is that it's not simply the 30 cycles per second. There are several parameters involved that actually create the mechanical environment for the cells that we're talking about here. There is the clock rate, the hertz, the cycles per second, how many times per second it buzzes. There's the amplitude or the intensity. How much does it actually displace? So you can imagine that if you're displacing at 1 cycle per second for 1 centimeter, the acceleration is actually quite small. But if you're doing that 50 times per second, 1 centimeter, the acceleration is frighteningly high. So there's hertz, cycles per second. There's intensity, which is a derivative of the displacement of the device. There's the duration, which Margaret and I have already talked about. How long per day do you need? How many times per day? And there's something called a refractory period, which is probably getting a little beyond what we want to talk about here. So to answer the question that the reader or the listener is posing, 30 hertz to us is very, very important because it's in the frequency domain of what your muscle contracts with. So as I pick up my coffee cup, my muscle is actually vibrating between 20 to 50 cycles per second. It's how muscle contracts. It's a very inefficient motor, right? So we try to mimic physiology, and that's why we were in this 30 hertz realm. But the other question to ask with your rheostat, or the way you're changing your frequency, is what is the displacement? So as Ian has already pointed out, the Marodyne device to generate 0.4 G at 30 hertz displaces about 120 microns, which is the width of around 2 human hairs, right? It's not very much. If your device is truly shaking and shaking you, chances are that the accelerations are way, 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 way above 1 G, where 1 G is Earth's gravitational field. We're a fraction of that. But most of the devices in gyms or some that are sold at Costco, et cetera, are frighteningly high. They're for elite athletes that are crazy enough to stand on them. So if you're osteopenic or osteoporotic, my strong advice to you, beyond exercising every day, the other piece of advice I suggest to you is to figure out what the G force is, what the acceleration of the device you're using is. And if it's above 2 or 3 G, be very, very wary of it. Not because I'm saying it, because the National Institutes of Occupational Safety and the International Standards Organization, a global conglomerate of safety in the workplace, say that these devices are not safe for exposure of more than 6 seconds per day. So do not stand on them, would be my advice to you.
Thank you,
Okay,
Clint. I think that's sorry. Can I just that was a topic I think a lot of people are confused about regarding the hertz, and they're missing the other piece. I'm glad you filled that out for us. Sorry, Mark. Go ahead.
I just want to add that they're still allowed to sell these devices because they're not like a device in the workplace. It's not regulated, and so that's what drives me crazy and drives me crazier. But just because things are being sold out there, it doesn't mean they're safe. Okay, that's all.
Could I just comment on that, because it reminds me of a funny story that I was being interviewed for something about 3 weeks ago, and I pointed out that I spent half my life, my professional life, saying how promising vibration is, and the other half of my professional life saying how dangerous vibration is. So I'm 100% with you. Sorry, Richard.
Okay, great. Okay, so we have 10 minutes left, and we have 48 questions to do. So we'll get through them. Okay. I'm really trying to make sure that the audience is getting their questions answered, and that's why we invited them. Okay, next question. This is regarding the age efficacy and the effect on an older body, active body. So first question is, I'm age 69. Is there any point in using the LIV? As I've read that the older a person is, the less responsive it is to the therapy such as this.
I could try that one as well. Sorry to barge in, but I'm very passionate about this sort of stuff. So the reader is correct that many of the studies we have shown in the elderly population, including the frail elderly with a mean age of around 84, that we don't show an anabolic response. We don't show a bone-producing response to the signal. But I'll remind people, as I believe Margaret has as well, that in osteoporosis, your first order of business is to not lose more bone. Before you can turn the ship around, you have to slow the resorption process. And everything that we've ever published, and in any paper that I'm aware of, that those standing on a low-intensity vibration device do not show progressive loss of bone. That is a worst case best outcome. It stops bone loss. And in several people, even in the elderly population, there is a bone gain, but that can be anecdotal. I admit we're a victim of statistics in the scientific world, so we can only present things as p-values. But I would say that anything you can do, eating right, exercising, maybe sending an LIV device, any way you can slow bone loss is the way to go.
Great. The opposite question from somebody else is, will individuals who do I think they're talking about themselves. Will individuals who do weight training 2 times a week, walk 1 hour at least a day, and do challenging lifting with gardening benefit as much from the device as someone who is not very active?
I can try that one. I'll take the bonus question for 200. Yes, I can try that one. So I go back to what Margaret and I and Ian have said earlier, exercising every day. So I applaud this person for getting out gardening, exercising, et cetera, et cetera. I would say that if you have an LIV device and you are committed to exercise, I would figure out how to schedule and budget your day. So let's say you wake up in the morning, you're brushing your teeth while standing on the device, or you're watching the Today Show or watching an interview with Margaret in the morning, standing on the device for 10 minutes or 5 minutes. This again is sort of predisposing your cell population to be more responsive to exercise later in the day. So I would say, although I have not done a study, we're doing a study right now in Australia, where the results will come out probably in about 1.5 years or 2 years, where they're standing on a device and exercising, asking that very question, but our science would suggest that it could be beneficial.
Okay. The next, I'll move on to another topic, which is the usage of the device, and really specifically around the frequency of use. There's been a bit of confusion about that. Okay, I use mine most days twice for 4 minutes each. I don't know why 4 minutes. Is that as good as 10 once a day?
So we have, it's sort of odd that we talked already about building up cell responses and basically harnessing the early transitioning, the early adaptation of cells early in the morning. So 3 hours later, that refractory period, taking advantage of that and sort of ratcheting up the response. So I would turn around and say it the other way. If I had 10 minutes to budget per day to send an LIV device, I would do exactly what the viewer is asking. I would stand on it twice per day for 4 minutes each day, rather than once per day for 10 minutes per day. The added advantage is that we have found in exit interviews in our clinical trials that people don't mind the device and they don't find it harmful. And many people find it pleasant, including my wife, who stands on it every day for 10 minutes per day. But it's hard to find that 10-minute bandwidth to do. It's easier to budget 2 short periods per day, and there might be an actual advantage to do it. So our clinical trials with kids are now go through the hospital board of 2 treatments twice per day because of encouraging compliance rather than efficacy.
Okay, so what I'll do is there's variations on that question. I think you've summarized the frequency of use and the refractory periods enough. So I think we'll move on from that. I won't ask any more of that. I'm going to move on to the next topic, or broader topic, and there's a bunch of these. So, and this is people asking specifically about a body area, part of the anatomy, and targeting specific parts of the anatomy. Okay, so here's the first one. Can we sit on the LIV? Can we sit on the LIV to improve the effectiveness in the lumbar spine? Could the vibration be targeted directly to the upper part of the body?
So we've studied this, not so much in doing a clinical trial on people sitting on the device, but sort of the opposite. What we did in Sweden is we went into the operating theater and put these Steinmann pins, these basically long pins with screw ends, into volunteers' trochanters, the end of the femur, the thigh bone, and into transverse processes of the spine, and showed that the transmissibility of the signal and actually how it works is very, very effective at 30 hertz, 30 cycles per second. So what that means in non-engineering speak is that if you stand on the device, 30 cycles per second is very, very efficient at reaching the hip and the spine. And it doesn't actually have to go through the buttocks, the gluteals, the musculature of the butt to transmit to the spine. So although I have not looked at transmissibility of sitting people, and I've not done a clinical trial on people sitting on the device, by standing, the signal is very, very efficient. And think of it as a very smart device. I think Ian had already described the device as being smart, that what happens is it's the load-bearing bones that see the signal the most. And your arms, which aren't being vibrated, see the signal very, very small, as a very, very small signal. So I would say standing would be the way to go if you can.
Okay. There's a few questions kind of around forearms and all that, and I think you've covered that. So just for the benefit of time, I think we should move on. Okay, so carrying on with anatomy, does the LIV benefit women with pelvic prolapse?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, please, please.
So it benefits them in the exact same way as it would benefit everybody else. The benefit is you don't get the impact on the pelvic floor the way you would jumping or doing heavy lifts where you might not be coordinating your breath and your pelvic floor activation to protect your prolapse. Certainly, if your prolapse is so bad that it is a grade 4, which means it is at this point, you absolutely definitely want to be using a pessary. And so, but it is more gentle than on your pelvic floor than walking.
Well, would it be of benefit? Okay, here's an interesting question. Would it be of benefit for a thin person to use a weighted vest on the platform?
I can shoot for that one too, unless Ian wants to take it. So the whole idea of the closed loop feedback acceleration, the brains of the plate, as Ian was describing, is that it is smart enough to take me, I weigh 165 pounds, versus Margaret, who looks like she weighs about 110, that the signal that it delivers to the standing person is adjusted to accelerate you or me in exactly the same way. It doesn't need to, it's not about force, it's about acceleration. So putting on a weighted vest would actually increase the signal and raise issues of safety, etc. I understand why you would want to wear a weighted vest, and I certainly see data that supports the use of weighted vests during exercises. But during the use of the LIV, if it were me, I would stick with a 0.4 G. So if you weigh 110 pounds or 120 pounds as a thin person standing on the device, I would let the device do the work. It's like golf, right? Swinging hard doesn't make the ball go further. Let the club do the work. That makes sense. For you golfers out there.
Okay, this is I've seen this question before. I'm glad it came in. I've heard that it matters what kind of directionality the vibrations have, and that side to side is better than vertical. Comment, please.
So the side to side is a teeter-totter. So there's a fulcrum here, and the platform moves back and forth like this, as opposed to the Marodyne device. Low intensity is vertical translation, or the high intensity vibration like a power plate is quite severe displacement. LIV is very small displacement. The alternating device, commercially available device, is something called a Galileo. And you could see by the movement of my arms that if you stand here, the amount of displacement is very different than when you're standing here, right? Even though it's displacing the same amount. So the risk of standing on an alternate is very hard to control the actual acceleration that's being delivered or the force that's being delivered. And it's very, very easy to quickly get in a range that could be at risk for somebody that's osteopenic or has T-scores at -1 and lower, osteoporotic. I am unaware of studies that directly compare side alternating versus high magnitude vibration versus low intensity vibration, but we have done studies where we looked at safety of them. And let me just put it this way. I, for one, will never stand on one.
Okay. Speaking about standing on it, this question is it okay to stand barefoot on the unit as opposed to, because the instructions say to wear socks?
So the reason we say socks is because people would write, can I wear my stiletto heels before I go out for a fancy dinner? Or can I worked in the clinic all day, I'm wearing crepe-soled shoes, right? So what we wanted to do is to get shoes out of the equation. So socks are there just because if you and then your spouse wears it and then your kids coming in, from the playground are standing on it, we just want to keep the plate clean. So socks seemed a good way of doing that, but to take shoes out of the equation so that the sole variables are not part of closed loop feedback. So socks are okay, bare feet are okay. I stand on it with bare feet because I like the way it feels.
Yeah, the other thing is it's a metal plate. So if you're in a cold environment or you have the device in a cold room, it's going to conduct a cold temperature and you might not be as comfortable as if you have socks on. So I think to Clint's point, it seems to be a strategy based on your circumstances.
But stiletto heels.
But if I could recommend, because it is a very slippery surface, those of you who have balance issues, if you're not using chairs beside you, consider the grippy socks. They have just a little bit of, silicone at the bottom, just to make the on and off a little safer. And
I will say that in some of the pediatric trials that we're doing, where the kids are a little more ornery and they don't want to take off their shoes because the pain in the neck, it's okay even to use shoes. Our clinical trials, because they're so carefully controlled, we want to keep all variables out. We try to keep things like shoe wear out of the equation.
Okay, Ian, you spoke up. I'm going to throw some questions your way, so these are yours. Since I anticipate buzzing for the rest of my life, what is the procedure to get the platform fixed if it breaks down?
So in the various countries, and I think a lot of people that are attending the webinar in the United States, we fix these. So in Canada and other countries, then the local distributor will have some method in place to get the device repaired. So they have a warranty. They're extremely robust. They're designed for a long life, 10 years or more. Hardly possible to break it mechanically unless you drive a tractor over the plate or throw it out of a large building. So it might be electronic or electrical problem that could occur in its life. So we're set up to fix those here in the States. And because we have to sort of make sure that the device is properly reset before it comes back out to you, we take care of the repair. So the comment to the audience would be to find out who the local entity is in your country and speak to them about repair availability. But my own business, we take care of all Marodynes in the United States and have done for 7 or 8 years now.
Great. Okay. So another question regarding the product, I'll put it out there. Does shutting off the platform early or stepping off and getting back on damage the platform?
No, it shouldn't do. So I think to Clint's point, if the person wants to use it, say 2 times a day, then there is no, as we understand it, no risk to the device that it's going to cease to operate or not give you a reasonable lifetime if you just do shorter sessions. So no, as far as we know, that's perfectly reasonable. Probably as a suggestion to people with osteoporosis, don't worry about switching it off because you have to bend over. or get down low to do that, it will sleep between uses. So when you get off it, it will not recognize a load and it will go into a dormant state. And after 5 minutes, it then goes into a sort of hibernation until you get back on. So those would be my comments.
Great. Okay, I think we'll move on to another broader topic because we're just running close on time. And there's quite a few questions about preconditions people have. So I'll just go through the ones that have shown up. By the way, we've had 23 more questions coming in live. I don't know if I'm going to get to those at all. I apologize for this, but there's obviously a lot of questions about this technology, the product. Okay, I'll start with the people who have submitted their questions early. Okay, so the first one is this type of therapy okay for people who've had posterior vitreous detachment, which is retinal detachment in the eyes, and are at risk of a retinal tear?
I could deal with that. So there is published literature with people standing on high magnitude whole body vibration devices, and peer-reviewed literature talk about detached retinas. And this is consistent with the ISO 2631 standards of risks of exposure to vibration. And yet another reason to be very wary of standing on high magnitude devices. In terms of LIV, we have never across all aspects of health and human welfare, never had a serious adverse event reported, including with the eye. And just to put it in context, that Margaret pointed out in talking about pelvic prolapse, that when you're walking down the street, when your heel hits the sidewalk, the G force of you decelerating is around 1.2 G. Down as you take your next step. As Ian has pointed out, the acceleration of the Marodyne device is 0.4 G, 40% of G. So in essence, what Marodyne is trying to do is deliver the benefits of mechanical without putting the risks of mechanical in. So I'm not going to say it's safer than walking because I don't want anyone to stop walking and just spend their life on an LIV device.
Is it okay? This actually showed up a few times. Is it okay to use the LIV if you have varicose veins?
So in our study with the frail elderly at the Harvard Research Center for the Aged, we did not accept that. That was not an exclusion criteria. So people in that cohort had varicose veins. We never had any adverse events from them. We didn't follow up on whether it was beneficial to them or anything. And I know several people with varicose veins at Stony that have not complained about them, but we have not studied the physiology of the varicose veins. A colleague of mine that I used to work with 2 decades ago studies blood flow in the lower limbs and actually shows that it enhances blood flow in the lower limbs. So maybe I do not know, it can actually help with varicose veins, but it's not harmful.
Okay.
I was just going to say while you're thinking of that one, if in concern, you can wear your compression socks while you're standing on them. Okay.
There you go. Okay. Does LIV harm or help arthritis in the knee?
I can do that both anecdotally and scientifically. My wife, who doesn't believe a word I say, stands on the device every single day. She's a devout runner and exerciser, and she comes back with knee pain. And the way she gets rid of her knee pain, she stands on the device and says it makes her knees feel better. It's sort of like if you've been ice skating and you get off your ice skates, it's sort of how you feel, sort of a good vibe, I guess. And we have done studies on looking at the morphology of cartilage in aged rats in a study published about 3 years ago, showing that in reality, and this is also true for the intervertebral disc, which is a form of cartilage, fiber cartilage, that it actually can be good in terms of infusing fluids and keeping morphology. So we have not studied cartilage in people, but in preclinical models, we have shown that it is beneficial to intervertebral disc and to articular cartilage. And actually, let me correct myself. We have looked at intervertebral disc in people and shown that it helps with the biochemistry and the geometry, the morphology of the disc.
Okay, and I'll go two more questions. I heard on an osteoporosis Facebook group that a physical therapist, not Margaret, stated that you are better to do 10 minutes of weight bearing or strength training a day instead of 10 minutes on an LIV platform. Care to comment?
I don't know. I'm not going to argue with anyone who's doing 10 minutes of weight bearing per day. I've never seen a study that compares the two, and I'd say do both if you can.
Okay, the last one, then we'll wrap up after that. And I apologize, there's so many questions, but I can't get to them all, but we're run out of time. And I think this is a pretty good one. Is there any data or observations over time of persons on Evinity, which is a pharmaceutical, osteoporosis pharmaceutical, also using the Marodyne LiV system? So basically a combination of the two. Is there anything you've seen?
So our clinical studies use for exclusion criteria people on osteoporosis medications, just because it contaminates, you don't know why bone is responding. So we have not specifically done a clinical trial looking at combination therapies, buzzing, staying on the device, plus Forteo or plus Fosamax or plus whatever. Everything that we see in our preclinical trials shows that at worst, they are additive, and at best, they are synergistic. They are not combative. So the preclinical data suggests that they could complement each other. So no reason to be afraid.
So Clint, how about the breast cancer study?
Oh, right. So that would be the preclinical data that I was thinking of. What Margaret's referring to is a paper we're about to submit. This is in a mouse model of breast cancer, and this is looking at zolendronate. Basically, as people know, that sort of therapy for cancer treatment can be pretty bad for bone quantity and quality. And so one of the downstream concerns of people being treated for breast cancer is risk of osteoporosis. So they're often prescribed a lot of drugs for the cancer, a lot of drugs for the osteoporosis. And we've done a study that looks at the mouse model with breast cancer, treated with breast cancer drugs, plus an osteoporosis drug, plus buzzing. And we show that the buzzing is as good as the anti-osteoporosis drug, but together they do work together. So thanks, Margaret. I necessarily wave my flag too much, but I guess that's what I'm doing. But it's exciting stuff. And so with that, and usually we do these very specific studies, like a breast cancer study in mice, to look at safety of it, right? Are we being promiscuous to the cancer? Because the Human Trials Board, before we start a human trial, wants to make sure it's safe, just like we did with the cancer trial at St. Jude's. We needed to show in mice, this is in collaboration with Gabe Pagnotti at MD Anderson and with Kiri Ness at St. Jude's Cancer Hospital, that these were safe. And once we show the human boards that we're not causing the cancer to spread, in some cases slowing the cancer, we're able to do it on human trials. So we're starting a human trial on women with breast cancer. So that's incredibly exciting. And it ends where I started. That's why I do what I do, is to use our science to treat disease. It's cool. I love it.
Okay, so I think we'll stop the questions. Any closing comments on the part of the panelists before I wrap it up? Anybody want to add anything? Margaret,
Could I actually ask a question more in terms of when questions?
Sorry, there's no more questions. I'm sorry, no more questions. I'm just kidding. You can ask your question, Margaret. Go ahead. I'll give you a ticket.
Clint, how would you like us to address them?
I think that Richard's done a magnificent job of sort of collecting them in sort of buckets that are similar. please feel free. The three of us or the four of us can get together and try to wrestle with them offline. And then when you post this on YouTube, if anyone's patient enough to watch it or read about it, we can have a collective, here are the questions that people were kind enough to ask. We didn't have time to answer. These are our general answers to these questions.
If anybody in the United States wants to ask about the Marodyne, specifically about the device, please let me know. I'll be very happy to answer your questions as best I can.
Right. So there is a follow-up email that I'll be sending out tomorrow to people that attended this with the different resources that they can link to, including the one back to BTT, which heads back to Ian. I'll close by thanking the panelists. I want to thank Dr. Rubin, Ian, and Margaret for taking the time today to address the questions. I want to thank the readers, clients, and followers for attending today's session, and certainly for all your questions. Sorry we couldn't get through them all, but we tried our best. We'll take it offline and try to assemble a document of some form. And with that, I'm going to sign off and say thank you very much for attending, and we'll see you at another future webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.